back into this area. We're talking about the personal realm of the Antichrist. Now, the Antichrist, just as a little bit of broad overview before we say anything else here, the Antichrist is going to be that final earthly ruler, ultimately over all the earth, at least influentially, but specifically over a confederation of 10 nations. This was represented in the book of Daniel, Daniel chapter 2, 10 toes in the fourth kingdom. Was also introduced in Daniel chapter 7, 10 horns on the fourth beast. And then it's talked about quite extensively in Daniel chapter 11, starting with verse 36 and on into chapter 12 of Daniel. So we've been looking at this Antichrist, trying to understand specifically where is he going to arise, where is he going to rule, and this is where the 10 horns come in, and why we'll spend some time tonight putting the final details of all of that together so that we're all on the same page concerning it. Okay, talking about the personal realm of the Antichrist. Now, the model of the Antichrist, as we've mentioned before, comes out of Daniel chapter 8. In Daniel chapter 8, Daniel the prophet was talking about Alexander the Great and the Greek kingdoms, the Hellenized kingdoms that came into being after his world conquest. Daniel says that there is going to be a model of the Antichrist, a prototype, if you will, someone who stands as the example of the ultimate Antichrist. He's going to arise out of one of the Greek kingdoms that comes out of Alexander's kingdom. He's called the Little Horn in Daniel chapter 8, and specifically we know that he has, even though Daniel doesn't specify it, history makes it all too clear that where he came from was the Seleucid kingdom, the king of the north. And now he's called the king of the north because the Seleucid kingdom is dead north of Israel. So if you're wondering why the king of the north, that's why, dead north of Israel. So that is the model historically, specifically in a person named Antiochus Epiphanes. Talked a little bit about this before, just let's review what he did. He went into the temple, he erected a statue of Zeus, he prohibited circumcision, he burned scriptures, he sacrificed a pig on the altar in the temple area, and, believe it or not, he called himself the manifested God, which is what Epiphanes literally, quite literally means. God come to light. And so that's Antiochus Epiphanes, and he was put into the realm of our view prophetically because he would be the person who probably more than anyone else, even in history, gives us a picture of what the final Antichrist will be like. Just about all of those things that you just heard me name off for what he did, the Antichrist will do something that's very analogous to virtually all of those things. So that is that part. Now the scriptures also tell us, now this is in Daniel chapter 7, and it's weird that in Daniel chapter 7 you talk about the fourth king, the later kingdom, in the line of kingdoms that come in history, whereas in Daniel chapter 8 you talk about an early one. Daniel chapter 8, the Greeks. Daniel chapter 7, when you get down to the interesting parts, it's about the Romans. And that might seem weird, in some respect, kind of like you're going back in time when you go to Daniel chapter 8. But I think there might be a reason for that I'll mention a little bit later. Now, in that part in Daniel chapter 7, in talking again about this final Antichrist, we are given the imagery of 10 horns, and in the midst of those horns rises up a little horn. So now we have the exact same phrase being used to refer now to the ultimate fulfillment. Daniel chapter 8, little horn used to talk about Antiochus Epiphanes, who was the model of the final Antichrist. In Daniel chapter 7, it talks about the little horn, and when it does, it's in reference to the ultimate and final Antichrist. So little horn used in both respects, so that we can understand that Antiochus Epiphanes was really there to show us something as a model. So anyhow, what can we learn about the imagery that's used there in Daniel chapter 7? I do have most of the verses cited up there. So here you see Daniel 7:8 cited for this particular place. When it talks about the 10 horns and it talks about the little horn, a couple of details are given to us in that imagery. Number one, the little horn is specifically stated as being amongst the 10 horns, and specifically being other than the 10 horns. That's a little different than the way the imagery was spoken of in Daniel chapter 8, because there the imagery is that there was 4 horns on the goat, and out of one of the horns, and it's out of that horn comes a little horn. Whereas in this particular place, the little horn is seen as amongst the 10 horns. That may mean something. We'll talk a little bit in a moment about that in more terms. But that's how it's basically stated. Now it says there that 3 of the 10 get ripped out by the roots. I mean, it's a thorough removal, in other words. It's not just horns getting sawed off. I mean, these things are ripped out by the roots. And, that's a sign that those kingdoms, for all intents and purposes, as something that is sovereign, something that is governmental, something that has authority, is absolutely kaput. So 3 horns get ripped out to make room for this little horn. This is in the imagery of Daniel chapter 7. Now, what that's telling us in those prophetic images is something about the career of the Antichrist. The Antichrist is going to rise up amongst a confederation of 10 governments, 10 kingdoms, 10 nations, if you will. And in that midst of that confederation, 3 of those countries, 3 of those nations, 3 of those kingdoms are going to cease to be in order to give room or give way to the Antichrist, who, and the way I interpret that is so that the Antichrist can take over personally those 3 realms. And so the imagery that we have in Daniel chapter 7 says this is the way the Antichrist is going to go. We're not really told how he comes on the scene. We're just introduced to him. He's already on the scene. He's a little horn. He's not a big horn. Does that mean something? We'll take a look at that as well. But he comes onto the scene without explanation. He's just there. And in the midst of the scene that he comes upon, you're near the end of time. 10 nations have come together. And what we learn from the Bible is that they come together ostensibly for one purpose. This we find out in the book of Revelation, chapter 17, that they come together for one reason only. For a very short time, this confederation exists, and it exists to give power, to give authority to the Antichrist. So what we have is a track where somehow or another this inconspicuous, maybe we could say, person, someone who is a little horn rather than a big horn, for whatever that means, in the midst of these 10 nations, suddenly rips out 3 of them. They become his, under his domain personally. So he goes from whatever he is on his own to being, maybe we'd say, a regional dictator. The 10 horns have given him all authority and power. He becomes a greater dictator, maybe we could say a pan-national dictator. He's not global yet. He doesn't ever become a global dictator. But what the Revelation does tell us, and we'll get to this a bit later on as well, not today, a few weeks in the future here. But what the Revelation tells us is that even though the Antichrist doesn't ever gain the same kind of authority over the rest of the world that he has over that 10-nation alliance, that 10-nation alliance, that's his empire. The rest of the world, however, he has influence over. And specifically, he has influence over through an economic system they call the mark of the beast. And this is something that the Antichrist has instituted that causes everyone to have to get a mark. We don't know what the mark is exactly. We know this, that somehow or another it is a representation of the name of the Antichrist. The name of the Antichrist, we are told, is the name of a man, and that number, the number of his name is 666. So it's basically an invitation to play gematria, which is a word game, because in a lot of alphabets, there's not a separate numerical system. So the letters do double duty. Not only are they your letters for writing words, but they're also do double duty to represent numbers. So like in our alphabet, if we did something like that, we don't, but if we did, A might mean number 1, B might mean number 2, on and on and on. And then you can skip for hundreds and thousands and all that kind of thing. So that's very true of Greek, that's true of Hebrew. It's not quite true of Romans, although Roman numerals actually do kind of borrow from their alphabet. But it's not quite the same systematic way that you see the Greeks did it or the Hebrews did it. So, but nonetheless, this is the Antichrist, and when he finally gets to a certain point in his influence in the world, he will institute this economic system, which basically brings everybody under his influence. They're not only under his influence, but I'll tell you this, because people are worried about the COVID shot and about other things going on today. So this is a good time to say something about that. Let me say this. I've had people directly ask me questions. Is the COVID vaccine the mark of the beast? And let me say, uncategorically, no. The COVID vaccine is not the mark of the beast. It can't be the mark of the beast. Why? Because it doesn't have the number of his name. It's not associated with that. And number 2, it's not associated with worship. The whole purpose of the mark of the beast is not just for economic convenience. The whole purpose is to have people express personal worship of the Antichrist. They worship the beast, and they take the mark as part of the worship. And so the mark of the beast is never going to be something that is given without that worship component. The mark of the beast will never be something that doesn't have the name component. It's like, don't be nervous and don't be scared. We have nothing to be nervous or worried about anyhow, right? I mean, we know whose we are, and he's watching over us. But we have nothing to be worried about in any of those things like, somebody will accidentally give me the mark of the beast and then I'm going to burn in hell forever. Oh no, that's scaring the life out of me. No, that's not going to happen. Nobody's going to take the mark of the beast unwillingly, and no one's going to take the mark of the beast accidentally. It's personal worship. And personal worship does not come by accident, and it doesn't come without intention. Okay? Now, it doesn't mean that not taking it is going to be a difficulty for those who are around at that point in time. But we have to understand that this COVID vaccine is not even close to fitting the description or meeting the qualifications for being the mark of the beast. So if you've heard anything like that, discount it. There are nuts out there. There are nuts on the YouTube. I'm on YouTube now. Maybe that makes it very clear that there's nuts on YouTube. But there are all kinds of crazy folks on all kinds of different kinds of media. And boy, I tell you what, it seems to me that the one thing that we see over the last year or so, whether it's coming from people that are not believers, maybe we could say the liberal intelligentsia, or whether it's coming from all of our brothers and sisters who are just a little bit flaky, it's all about fear. Whether it's coming from this way or it's coming from that way, it's all about fear. It's not about facts, it's not about judgment, it's not about using the gray matter that God has given us. It's all about fear. Everybody is being manipulated and being pressed into action one way or the other by fear. And I got to tell you this, fear is not faith, and faith is not fear. They're opposites of each other. And if we're being driven by fear, we're not being driven by faith. If we're being driven by fear, we're not hearing God. If we're being driven by fear, something's wrong. Okay? And so this is just a good point for me to get up on my soapbox here and kind of go a little bit off of notes tonight and talk about something that seems to be important right now. Whether you get the vaccine or not, that's your own business. And there's people who have very good, well thought out reasons for not doing it. And there's people who have very well thought out reasons for doing it. My opinion on that is, do whatever you think is right to do. If you think it's good and right to take the vaccination, well, by all means, don't let somebody else tell you what to do with your own body, your own life. And if you think it's a good thing not to take the vaccination, well then by all means, do that. Don't let somebody do something with your body that they're not supposed to do. And regardless of whether you take it or you don't take it, I'm still going to love you. And I know God's still going to love you. So, just, what can I say? Get steady, get clear-eyed, and make the decision that makes sense to you about these matters. Okay? So, having said all that, the Antichrist is basically ripping out 3 of these horns of the 10 for his own personal room, if you will. And I think that what's wrapped up in that is that he's actually taking control over this. He's displacing the authority of the horns that were there. And what do they say? Power loves a vacuum. Into the vacuum will go the Antichrist. And so his realm goes from himself to those 4 nations, himself and 3 others, and then on. Now, there's a bit of a problem in trying to figure out exactly how this is configured. Now, we know there's a 10-nation alliance, and we know that 3 horns get ripped out, but does that mean that there's 7 kings, and the Antichrist is one of them? Does it mean that there's 7 kings, and then the Antichrist is another one? Does it mean that there is a formulation that ends you up with the number 8? Or does it mean that the formulation is meant to end at the number 7? And believe it or not, the reason this is difficult to figure out is there's actually a biblical case that can be made either way. You can make a biblical case that what's entailed is 10 kings, 3 get ripped out, and there's another one. And the case there wraps up around Daniel's use of the word another and other. In other words, he's using words that say that the little horn is not part of the 10 horns. The little horn is not actually one of them. He is just among them. He's an other horn amongst the 10 horns. All right? So if that language is meant to be very narrowly interpreted and very focused on that particular reality, what it means is that when you rip out 3 and you have a little one, you end up with 7 that are not ripped out, 3 that are, and the Antichrist. So that's 8. And you see that's right here. 10 plus 1 minus 3 equals 8. Can that refer, can this be the way that we're supposed to see it? There's a place in Revelation chapter 17, verse number 11, that maybe says this is not a bad way of seeing this. Now, in Revelation chapter 17, verse number 11, it's talking about a succession of kings. It's referring to the woman riding the beast, and the beast has 7 heads, and what was being described there to John is the fact that the 7 heads represent the seven hills that the woman sits on. Now that means Rome. That aspect of that vision is referring to Rome. So the whore of Babylon is at the time of the end a Roman symbol. Keep that in mind. That'll come back on us, or come back to help us. It should help you today. I got a text from some folks that keep an eye on some interesting news articles, and I actually got it from 2, maybe 3 sources, which is pretty cool. But the Pope is cozying up to Erdogan in Turkey. And the interesting thing about that Now, I don't want to get ahead of myself, but I'm going to get a little ahead of myself here. Ultimately, we're going to get to the place where I think I can prove to you that the likelihood is that Erdogan is the Antichrist, and the likelihood is that the current Pope is the false prophet. All right? Now, even if that's not the case, and Erdogan is not the guy, even though he looks very, very good for the role, even if it's not him, whoever it will be, and it will be someone soon, the Pope, whoever he is at that time, will be the false prophet. That is something that is, is hard sometimes for folks to get their minds wrapped around, but I think that's going to be the case. And I think furthermore, it really fits in well. Believe it or not, I was listening to John MacArthur the other day, and he was talking about the Islamic approach to end times. And I like him because he's usually very well thought out and well researched, and he does a pretty good job of doing the things that he does. But I was really interested in, he was talking about the Islamic eschatology, and basically he was making the point that between the Mahdi, who is their messianic figure, and the return of Christ, the return of Aizu, or whatever his name is in the Quran, that they have basically a two-figure end times group of people that will be bringing things to the ultimate end of time. And the point that he was making is that to the Muslims in the Quran, the one that we call the Antichrist, they call Messiah, and the one that we call the false prophet, they call Jesus. And so it's like really interesting, because we're going to be talking a little bit about a Muslim connection here tonight. This really, even though I'm jumping ahead, this really does somewhat fit into all of this. It really comes down to this, is that the Pope, whoever he is at the time when this is coming about, I think is going to step right in and play that role of representing Christ to the rest of the world in a false way. Jesus said, beware, many false Christs will come. People will say, I am he, don't listen to them, they're not the one. And I do believe that the Pope is probably going to be taking on a role similar to that as the false prophet, where whoever doesn't come in because of the Muslim connection will end up coming in because of the Catholic connection. And all of it will fall under the delusion that looks at the Antichrist and sees him as God come to earth. So, hopefully that didn't lose you, but that's what I think is happening with that. If the 8 configuration, and remember this comes from the fact that every image that we have, usually, particularly in the Revelation, is usually a combination of 10, 7, and of course if you take 7 away from 10, 3. 10, 7, and 3, 10, 7, and 3. You see this all the time in the imagery associated with the Antichrist, particularly in those images that try to represent his source of power, his source of authority. So the 8 configuration comes out of that by looking at the Antichrist as the odd one out. So even though the 10, the 7s, and the 3 represent the kingdom from which he arises, he himself is not that. He is kind of on top of it, if you will. So that gives you the possibility of the 8 configuration. If that's meant to apply to the beast, and when the New Testament says the beast, particularly when the Revelation is talking about the beast, it's actually talking about the empire of the Antichrist. It's not necessarily talking about the Antichrist personally. You have to look at what's there in context to understand that, but it's particularly in the images of the beast, it's definitely pointed toward the reality of his empire, his kingdom. If the Antichrist, the word Antichrist, if that's pointing to the whole thing, in other words, you have this beast and it has 10 heads. perhaps the Antichrist is not one of the heads. The Antichrist is the whole thing. The 10 heads are things that give him power. So anything that's true about the 10 heads, 10, 3 get ripped out, 7, right? Anything that's true of them is not necessarily something that's meant to be descriptive of the Antichrist himself. It may just be that he is the being represented as the whole unified thing, and those are the details about where he gets his power from. So, if that's the case, then what it means is that basically the Antichrist may be someone who comes out of almost nowhere. He may have almost no power at all. If he's not one of the 10, this is, right? If he's out, if the representation is that he is the entire that ends up more or less shadowing over the rest of his authority at source and the kingdoms that are there represented in the 10 horns. If he's a little horn amongst them, but not one of them, then it means that his career may be something that's shocking, that almost comes out of nowhere. That, you don't really hear about him, he's not really making a splash, and then all of a sudden, here he is being looked to by these 10 horns, and before you know it, because it says they're only together for an hour to give power to the Antichrist. So, boom, boom, out of nowhere, the 10 horns look to him, and almost as soon as they do, he ends up snatching 3 of them for his own. Okay, that's the way that things would look if the 8 is the proper configuration. If the Antichrist is the whole, but he's from one of the 3 ripped out horns, he's not one of them, but maybe he comes from that territory, in other words, that leaves 7 in place, plus 1 in the place of 3. So that makes 8 as well, right? So if he's from one of the 3 that get ripped out, if he's from one of those territories, just by way of example, this doesn't mean anything, but just by way of example, let's say that we're talking about Syria, Lebanon, and Turkey, and they get ripped out. If he's from one of them, if his career has gone through one of those to get to the place where he's at, then what it means is the 3 are being replaced by another 1, which gets you to 8. So there's 2 ways, basically, you can do the math to make the formulation 10 plus 1 minus 3 equals 8. And they're all in some respects plausible to some degree or another. If the 7 configuration, and that's 10 minus 3 equals 7, describes the beast, the Antichrist would have to be one of the 10. So even though it says that he's other than the 10, he does come up amongst them. And so that could be representing the fact that he's actually not coming from the legitimate line of those 10 kings. This could be a general seizing power. This could be a president dissolving parliament and the Constitution. Any of those kinds of things could figure into the kind of scenario that's being painted here. He would have to come, if that's the case, from one of the 7. Because if the 7 configuration is the one that's in mind by the Holy Spirit, then what that means is he's telling us is the Antichrist is one of the other 7 kings who reaches out and snatches 3 weaker brothers, if you will, as he's making his play to get in the big chair, if we can put it that way. So if the 7 configuration is the way it looks, that's how things are going to fall out. If the 8 configuration is true, then either of these 2 could fall out. Does that make sense? You all still with me? Do we know which one is so? Well, not exactly. There's just enough that requires inference. There's just enough that you look at and it's only implied but not stated distinctly and directly, so that it's hard for somebody like me to understand exactly how that's going to work out. But it's going to work out one way that the other. Those are the ways it can work out, and it's going to work out one of those ways. All right? Now, if we look at, now I'm going to get into a little bit of my own opinion about these things, right? If we look at the personal realm of the Antichrist through the model Antiochus. Now, Antiochus came out of one horn amidst the four of Alexander's reign, the one coming up between the 10. Maybe that implies the same relationship, because little horn and little horn, remember I said that ties those two images together so that we understand they're in some respects looking at the same reality. One who is the type, one who is the antitype, one who is the model, the other is the fulfillment. So if that's so, then the fact that he is amongst the 10 horns doesn't necessarily, shouldn't be stressed too much as far as making him distinct from the nations that are represented in those horns. And if that's the case, then what it means is that the Antichrist could have the same relationship in Daniel chapter 7 to the horns as he does in Daniel chapter 8, which means that he's one of the ones that are there. He's connected to one of the ones that are already there. In that case, then the Antichrist couldn't come from the three that get ripped up. Otherwise, he would be getting ripped up, right? So he won't be one of the three, which means that he'll be one of the other 7. And I think that these passages here kind of favor that interpretation. Revelation chapter 13, verses 1 through 3. There we get the image of the Antichrist and all the terrible things that it's this 10, 7, 3. These numbers are always together in those forms. Incidentally, this is the chapter that tells us more than any other place in the entire Bible about the Antichrist and what he's up to. So, you get both the Antichrist and the false prophet clearly spoken about in Revelation chapter 13. And Revelation chapter 17, verse 3, that image is brought out again, and it seems like the flavor is the 10, 7, 3 scenario. There's a biblical case for 10 leading to 7 or 11 leading to 8, which is what I basically have said already, right? You can make a biblical case for either of those. Personally, I lean toward the 4 horns becoming the personal domain of the Antichrist. So what I personally lean to, because it seemed to be cleaner, with more of the eschatological prophecies concerning this, 10, 7, 3, because that seems to be the case to me, that it's much more connected to that, it's much more simple, it's much more clear. What I think is that the Antichrist will be one of the 7 that doesn't get ripped out, and that the 3 that he rips out will be, neighbors and friends that he's taking advantage of. We're going to talk about today, and we're going to get a little speculative here. I've told you before that this man, Recep Erdogan, the present president of Turkey, looks incredibly good. In other words, he has the right CV to be the Antichrist. He's in the right place. He's at the right time. The things that are going on in the world around him are ripe, and he has been doing things that almost seem like he understands this and is kind of setting things in place for that 10 horns. He is from Turkey, which was for years and years a secular country, primarily, and a member of NATO, candidate for status in the European community, very much, you would say, maybe the most Western of all the Muslim-dominated countries in the world. And then Erdogan came to power. And since he's come to power, he's an Islamicist. And so he wants the nation to regain their Islamic heritage. He wants it to be something that is front and center in who they are as a people, culturally, politically, internationally. He is a person who has come out and has stated clearly that ultimately he wants the caliphate that was last represented in the Ottoman Empire, which was centered in Turkey. He wants it restored. And of course, you can hardly say that somebody in his position of power would want such a thing if he didn't see himself as the prime candidate for being the caliph. And so this is Erdogan. He is making maneuvers and moves to tie places like Libya and the Sudan and Azerbaijan and Cyprus, Syria, Iraq, closely to him. In some cases it's friendly, in other cases it's occupational. But man, it's just like watching a spider weave its web. It's just very, very active. So if he is the guy, and we are in the time when this is going to happen, then yes, I do believe that's true. But if he is the guy, and we are in the time that this is to happen, the Antichrist, Erdogan, would have to seize dictatorial control of Turkey to fulfill the scenario that we've looked at from the images, right? He would have to seize dictatorial control of Turkey, and then he would have to subjugate any three of these powers: Iraq, Azerbaijan, Lebanon, Cyprus, or Syria. Any three of those would fit the bill. Any three of those would tell us that we have the fulfillment of that particular prophecy, coming into our view. Now, what's going on in the news that makes this interesting? He has troops in Iraq, and he said he's not taking them out. Right? In Azerbaijan, he just recently sponsored their war with Armenia. They won that war, and now they have a new pact with Turkey, and Turkey has military people in Azerbaijan. Lebanon, nothing going on there yet, but interesting note, just this past year, Erdogan said he's ready to send troops to Lebanon if the need arises. What does that mean when you have a power-hungry person, right? Think Hitler, right? When he says, I'm going to send troops to the Sudetenland if I need to. It's, get the tanks there. He's sending troops there. It's going to happen. So Cyprus, he brought this up just in the last month, that maybe it's time for Turkey to put some guns and some boots on the ground in Cyprus. Northern Cyprus is the Turkish part of that island. They've broken off and claimed independence, and now they are basically a client state of Turkey, and things are getting intermeshed there. And again, are they going to, if he goes to Cyprus, are they going to bother with the legitimacy of the Greeks in the south? I don't think so. And then Syria, guess where he has troops? Syria. So he has troops in Syria, wants to put troops in Cyprus, willing to put troops in Lebanon, has troops in Azerbaijan, has troops in Iraq. If you've been wondering why I've been flipping out this past year about end times, these are some of the reasons. I mean, things are just really coming together in ways that have just made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. That doesn't prove anything yet. But boy, I tell you what, talk about getting the table set. The dinner bell's about to ring. That's what it seems like to me. If the 8-figure configuration is right, and again, my preference is for the 7, but if the 8 configuration is right, then Erdogan is the Antichrist, and he would have to seize dictatorial control of Turkey, and then subjugate any 2 of Iraq, Azerbaijan, Lebanon, Cyprus, or Syria. How plausible is this scenario? Either way, very. Now, here's our map of the current countries in the area, and the 10 horns. we've looked at this before. I added a little bit of highlighting, try to make it pop and stand out better, and to show a couple of things that could go either way. So when we look at the realm of the Antichrist, we're going to find out that Libya has to be there because it's named in the Scriptures specifically. The Sudan has to be there because it's named in the Scriptures specifically. Now, it's named under the name of Cush, and you'll see a lot of interpreters refer to Ethiopia as Cush. That's wrong. That just does not match up with any really ancient record. Cush is the Nubians and the land around Nubia. Guess where that is? That's right here. So this is Cush. So Cush, Egypt, Libya, named specifically in the Scriptures as being subjugated by him. They are going to be part of the 10. Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon, that group of 4, will be part because the Antichrist has to fulfill the designation of the King of the North. The King of the North has to revive in the Antichrist. And the King of the North, we've looked at some maps, I'll get back to those in a second just to refresh you. But the King of the North was in those lands. The King of the North covered basically all of Syria, a big chunk of Iraq, at times all of Lebanon, and a good chunk of Turkey. So in those 4 countries, they have to be part of it. So we have 3 nations down here have to be part of it. We have 4 nations up here have to be part of it. So 7 of the 10, I think, are specified clearly enough in Scripture to understand that these must be part of the 10 horns. Right? Now, where does the other ones come in? Here's my suggestion, and this is maybe just as informed by current events as anything else, but the current events made me do some more historical research, and I'm prepared to add the Azerbaijan, right up here. It's in 2 chunks, separated by Armenia. But the Azerbaijan was actually part of the Roman Empire. What did we know about the Antichrist because of the reference to Daniel chapter 7 and Daniel chapter 8? Is that the Antichrist, the little horn, will come from the place where the King of the North, the Seleucid Empire, superimposes upon the Roman Empire. In other words, the Roman Empire forms the furthest extent possible, and what's inside of the Seleucid Empire within the Roman Empire has to be part of it. So what that means is this was actually controlled thanks to, remember we talked about Pompey? He's the one who got up into this area. He went the whole way up into here, and then all of this area became Roman provinces. So Azerbaijan, we'll add that. That gets us up to 8. We'll add Cyprus. I think Cyprus is probably a pretty good go. Definitely part of the Greek realm from time to time. Roman access to it for sure. Looks good. So that gets us up to 9. That leaves what? 1 more. Now the one thing in looking at all of this, you notice that this line goes up around here. You know, there's like this circle around Jordan. That's because Jordan is specifically excluded by the Scripture. The Scriptures tell us that Ammon and Moab and Edom will escape the grasp of the Antichrist. This is all in Daniel chapter 11, incidentally. So those 3 traditional peoples, the Ammonites, the Moabites, and the Edomites, they're not going to be included. Where is their home, their traditional home? Right here in Jordan. So Jordan's not going to be part of the 10, even though it's right there in the midst of it, which leads, it's got to, you got to find one under the kingdom. Now, I've always thought that Greece was a good candidate, and it is from the standpoint of history, from the standpoint of location. It isn't from the standpoint of culture. And the reason I say that is that the Greek culture is very much a Western culture, very much directed more toward that worldview. The Antichrist is going to be a Muslim. It makes sense coming from Turkey, right? He's going to be a Muslim, and I think that I can more or less demonstrate that from what's said about him in Daniel chapter 11. But let's just take that to the bank and call it true for right now. The Antichrist is going to be a Muslim. If that's true, then the likelihood is that his 10-nation confederacy is going to be Muslim as well, right? And if that's the case, then that brings, we have to start looking for another possibility of a Muslim nation. I don't think it's going to be Persia, which is Iran today, and even though there's a lot of things that would make sense for that, but they're shown to be part of the Gog and Magog alliance, and that's not necessarily anything that is circumscribed by the Antichrist and his 10 horns. It could be Saudi Arabia, and the only thing that always has made me question whether or not this could be the case is just this, is how far does the Bible intend us to take the thought of Edom? Now, Edom comes from Esau, okay, and so that was the brother of Isaac, and so you have, or the brother of Jacob, excuse me. You have this person who is settling in an area that's south of Israel, but we don't know how far it extended at any given time. Most maps historically keep it up here pretty much in the area of southern Jordan, but some historians have extended the range a little bit further. And if that's the case, it would mean that Esau's population, Edom's population, found a way to filter in to Saudi Arabia. If that's the case, then, would the exclusion of the Edomites also exclude Saudi Arabia? That's the question, right? I think, historically, I've thought probably so. At this point in time, I think maybe not. Not certain. So it's basically going to be the 9 that are pretty easily establishable by us, as we've already had. And then one of these, I would think. Either Greece somehow or another coming into what is apparently going to be a Muslim cabal, or Saudi Arabia, which would be a more natural ally in that respect, coming in, but only if this is clearly meant by the Holy Spirit to be segregated from Edom, which is very possible. All right, so that's the 10 horns. That's where they're at. That's what we're looking for. Do you see how quickly, given the things that I've already said about what Erdogan is doing, how quickly this can come together? He's got troops in Libya, invited there. He settled a civil war there, and Libya is basically his vassal now. He has an arrangement with Sudan, military help, various other kinds of economic and supply help. So he's making a move for the Sudan. This is all coming together today, right in front of us as we study this. That's the King of the North, the 10 horns revived. Okay, let's see. And here's what I just said to you, if you need words to go with it. Specifically, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, and Turkey. They have to be there. Egypt, Libya, and Sudan have to be there. A nation that's excluded is Jordan, because Edom, Moab, and Ammon. And there's the verse numbers, incidentally, in Daniel 11 that talk about this. And then the nations that are possible: Azerbaijan, Cyprus, Saudi Arabia, if it's not Edom, Greece. These are all the things that are possible. Now, this little thing right here, this comes out of Daniel chapter 11 as well. in describing the Antichrist, and I'll end with this without developing it, just as a taste for maybe things next week, if, God willing. The way that the Antichrist is described in Daniel chapter 11 is that he doesn't care about any gods, but he calls himself God above everything that's called God, which is a very Antiochian thing for him to do, right? But furthermore, it says that even though that's the case, he does use for his own benefit, if nothing else, another god. Now, that other god is a god of strongholds. This is the way it's described. Or sometimes you'll see a god of fortresses. Maybe a god of military installations. I mean, there's a number of different ways that you can translate it into English, but it's basically about strongholds, places of, secure places that are of safety. A god of safety or strongholds unknown to the fathers, his fathers at the time of Daniel. Now, Daniel's prophesying all of this someplace in the latest, the mid 500s BC. So, who is a militaristic god unknown to the people in 500 BC?
Not Muhammad.
Not Mohammed.
Muslim religion.
It's Allah, right? The god Allah, and the way that Allah is described in the Quran is that he is a militant god. He is a god of conquest. The Muslims are meant to conquer the entire world and bring them all into subjection to Allah. If they won't submit, ultimately death is the only solution that's going to be accepted. That's that God. Now, I cannot think of another God. I went and looked, and believe me, I cannot find another God who fits this description other than Allah. I can't find another religion that fits this description other than Islam. And so, I take that description as referring to the Antichrist being at least a nominal Muslim. That's the root that he's coming from. And a lot of his ability to relate and network in his power structures and then throughout the world is going to come through that particular connection. In fact, when he conquers things, he's going to divide land, and whose name is it going to be? This unknown God.